There are love stories that make you believe in soulmates, there are breakup films that make you call your ex at 3 in the morning, and then there are films like Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian, that don't give you the luxury of a clean label, that sit somewhere in the space between a nightmare and a hug, that whisper to you, this is not about love, this is about survival, and refuse to let you look away, and from the very first frame, from the moment Siska opens her eyes in that impossibly quiet, perfectly arranged bedroom, you know you're not in a comforting romance, you're in a trap that's been decorated to look like happiness. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because I want to know if you're hearing this from a messy little room that looks like real life, or somewhere that feels a bit too perfect for its own good, just like the world this film drops us into. And I also want you to sit with a question while we talk about this movie. If your life suddenly became everything you said you wanted, would you notice if it wasn't really yours anymore, or would you let yourself believe? Because belief is easier than freedom when freedom comes with a cost, and that's the sting that Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian leaves on your skin long after the end credits roll. This 2025 Indonesian psychological drama that shows up pretending to be a melodramatic romance and then slowly, methodically, peels off its own skin to reveal a story about control, about scripts that are written for us, and about the terrifying courage it takes to tear up those scripts even when they are gilded with love songs and wedding decorations. So let's breathe together for a second and step into Siska's world, because the film doesn't give you a countdown, it doesn't warm you up, it just throws you in. She wakes up in a bedroom that looks like it was pulled straight from a lifestyle magazine, sunlight perfectly spilling across off-white sheets, a vase of fresh lilies that look like they were arranged by someone with an Instagram aesthetic, no clutter, no half-finished life, no evidence that anyone has ever made a mistake here, and there's something wrong with that image, even before you know the story, because real rooms hold ghosts, they hold yesterday's coffee and last week's arguments, and this room holds nothing except silence, and Siska's face, the first time we see it, is already suspicious, already tired, like she's waking up from a life, not just from sleep, and the camera lingers a little too long on her eyes as she blinks, like it's asking her, do you recognize this place? And in that pause between the blink and the breath, you realize she doesn't, not really, and that's the first chill, the first tiny crack in the perfect world setup that the film builds with such meticulous care, because on the surface Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian could easily be marketed as just another glossy streaming-era Indonesian romance, the kind that drops on a Friday night and fills your timeline with crying emojis and quote tweets of poetic dialogues about forever, and yet from the very beginning it's more interested in questions than in kisses. It was released in 2025 into a landscape where love stories were already vying for attention every week, a time when Indonesian cinema had been steadily pushing into more daring spaces, blending genre, questioning tradition, playing with the line between the real and the surreal. And this film quietly slid into that conversation without flashy marketing, almost like the movie itself wanted to sneak into your life the way the world inside it sneaks up on Siska. And whether you watched it in a crowded cinema or in your dimly lit bedroom with your phone too close to your face, chances are the opening lulled you into that same uneasy calm, with its slow pacing, its soft colors, the way it lets you settle into the rhythm of perfection before it begins to suffocate you with it, because Siska's life looks flawless on paper. She has a wealthy fiancé whose smile has the kind of charm you only see in commercials, a future in-law family that seems bizarrely invested in her happiness, a house that looks like somebody took every Pinterest board about dream home and turned it into reality, and a routine that is choreographed down to the way the maid pours her coffee. But it's that exact choreography that the film keeps poking at, like a bruise, small gestures that feel just a little too rehearsed, like the neighbor who greets her every morning at the exact same time, with the exact same words, or the way her fiancé always arrives home to the sound of the same song on the radio, always at the same point in the chorus, like someone hit play on a script instead of letting life happen. And if that sounds familiar to you, if it reminds you of other cinema, The Truman Show, Black Mirror episodes, the glossy dystopias of sci-fi, you're not wrong, but Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian doesn't lean into high-tech explanations or dystopian aesthetics. It keeps everything grounded, domestic, recognizably Indonesian, and that's what makes it so unsettling. This isn't a simulation built by machines, this is a fantasy maintained by people, by culture, by expectations, by the soft violence of being loved the right way, by the right person, while slowly being erased, and we only really begin to feel the weight of that when Uni enters the frame, not like a grand plot twist, but like a glitch, like an error in a system that's been running too smoothly. She shows up first as a voice note on Siska's phone, a name that Siska doesn't seem to recognize, and yet the second she presses play the air changes, the soundtrack drops into a low hum, and we listen with her to this voice that is shaking, desperate, saying in Indonesian, "Sis, if you get this, please, just remember we were here once, okay? Remember that this is not love." And Siska frowns, rewinds, listens again, and you can see the confusion fighting with something deeper in her eyes, that eerie sense of déjà vu when you hear a stranger sound like home. But the film doesn't resolve that feeling right away. Instead it places this name, Uni, like a splinter under Siska's skin and lets it fester as the days in her perfect life loop and loop. Breakfast with her smiling future mother-in-law who always asks the same polite questions. Shopping trips where the credit card never declines. Nights where her fiancé holds her a little too gently, like she's a porcelain doll, not a person who could ever wriggle away. And surrounding all this is silence, the kind of curated silence that money buys. High walls, expensive carpets that swallow the sound of footsteps, air conditioning that hums away any trace of the outside, and that silence becomes a character of its own, constantly reminding you that something is being kept out, or in. The film is genius in how it withholds, how for a huge chunk of the first act it refuses to explain anything to you. It puts you in Siska's headspace so effectively that you begin to share her disorientation, her sense that everything is both too much and not enough, that her days are full of privileges but empty of reality. And that's when the question creeps in, what if you woke up inside the life someone else thought was good for you, with no memory of choosing it yourself? Would you even recognize the betrayal if everyone around you called it love? And more importantly, how much of that feels like a sci-fi premise and how much of it feels uncomfortably close to what so many people actually live through, especially women who are praised for stability, while slowly losing their own names under titles like wife, mother, caretaker, muse. Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian understands that pain intimately, and it builds its world out of it, which brings us to the way it tells its story. Because this is not an exposition-heavy film, it doesn't sit you down and feed you lore. It lets images and patterns do the talking, like the repetition of one seemingly harmless line that Siska's fiancé keeps saying, "Aku cuma mau kamu tenang," I just want you to feel at ease. And the first time you hear it, it sounds sweet, reassuring, but by the fifth or sixth time, when he says it after she flinches at a sudden loud noise outside, or when she asks why she can't remember anything from before this engagement, it loses its comfort and starts to sound like a threat dressed as a lullaby, like what he really means is, don't ask questions, don't disturb the set, and if he's the polished face of Siska's cage, then Uni is the crack in the wall, the water slowly seeping in. We finally see her in person when Siska, haunted by that voice note, sneaks out of the house for the first time without the driver, taking a ride-hailing bike in a simple t-shirt and jeans that look almost comical on her now, like she's trying on someone else's skin, and heads to a rundown part of the city she doesn't remember ever going to, but her feet seem to know where to walk, turn, stop, until she's standing in front of a cheap Costco's and with peeling paint and a fading sign. And there, sitting on the stairs with a cigarette and eyes that have forgotten how to be surprised, is Uni, who looks up, sees Siska, and in one of the most devastatingly quiet moments in the whole film, her cigarette drops from her hand and she whispers, "Kamu balik, you came back." Like she's been waiting at that doorway for 100 years, and yet Siska's response is not a reunion, it's confusion, a polite smile you'd give to a stranger on the street, a hesitant, "Maaf, kita pernah kenal," and you watch Uni's face fall in slow motion, your stomach clenching because you suddenly realize that the love story in this film was never between Siska and her fiancé, it was always between Siska and this woman in front of her, who has clearly loved her enough to stand on the dark side of the city holding on to a memory that Siska has been encouraged, maybe even forced, to forget. This is the moment where the film's tagline, the idea that it's not about being loved but about surviving, truly lands, because you start to suspect that what Siska escaped from wasn't poverty, or heartbreak, or chaos, but a love that didn't fit the world's script, and that somewhere along the way, somebody decided that instead of changing the script, they would rewrite Siska, and suddenly, every polished detail of her new life starts to curdle in your mind, the mother-in-law who's too eager, the fiancé who's too patient, the eerie perfection that feels less like a gift and more like a witness protection program from her own past self. The film is delicate in how it unfolds this revelation. It doesn't turn it into a sensational twist, it doesn't even center big arguments or shouting matches, instead it leans into long, heavy conversations in cramped spaces, Siska and Uni sitting on that staircase, knees almost touching but hearts galaxies apart, Siska asking functional questions like, how did we meet, and Uni answering with stories that are so specific, so painfully mundane in their detail that they couldn't possibly be invented, late-night instant noodles shared during blackouts, a fight over which singer writes the saddest lyrics, a shared umbrella in a rainstorm that turned into a sprint and a fall and laughter that echoed for days, and as Uni talks you see flashes of those memories as quick, grainy flashbacks, like found footage, messy and alive, in stark contrast to the carefully lit present, and you can feel Siska's defenses cracking, the part of her that's been sedated by luxury starting to wake up and realize that the emptiness she feels is actually the outline of someone who used to be there, someone sitting right in front of her. This is where the film's emotional core lies, in the relationship between these two women, and if we talk about characters in Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian, we can't talk about them as archetypes or chess pieces in a metaphor, because the film gives them too much messy humanity for that. Siska is not just the amnesiac protagonist, she's this complex mix of curiosity and fear, someone who is deeply conflict avoidant, who learned somewhere along the way that being good means being agreeable. And you see that in the way she interacts with her fiancé early on, the way she laughs a half-second too late at his jokes, the way she says, okay, to plans that visibly make her uncomfortable, weddings she barely seems present in when they are discussed, and that's why when she first meets Uni, with all the weight of shared history that she cannot access, her instinct is not to blow everything up, it's to compartmentalize, to say, I'll think about it, to visit Uni in secret while still going home to the mansion at night, caught between two gravitational pulls, one of comfort, safety, recognizability, and one of raw, complicated love that demands she remember who she was before she became a decorative object, and Uni, on the other hand, could have easily been written as the stereotypical tragic ex, bitter and broken, but the film doesn't do that. It gives her a life outside of Siska, a small circle of friends, a job that barely pays the bills but keeps her grounded. It shows her having bad days and silly ones, shows her failing to move on not because she's weak but because the world they lived in wasn't designed to let people like her love loudly. And so the scraps of affection she shared with Siska became like sacred relics she clings to, a proof that she wasn't crazy to believe in something that never got a happy ending. And what's incredible about her performance, the actor's eyes in particular, is how much anger and gentleness coexist there, how Uni can tell Siska, you left me, in one breath and then in the next say, but I'm not here to pull you back into hell, because she has seen what Siska had to run from before, not just them as a couple but the pressures, the threats, the subtle cruelty of a society that would rather rewrite a woman's entire life than admit she loves someone it doesn't approve of. The film doesn't villainize Siska for forgetting, it doesn't sanctify Uni for remembering. It just lets them both be people making impossible choices in a world that keeps insisting on calling control by a prettier name, love. And then there's the fiancé, the man Siska is supposed to be grateful for, whose love is presented as salvation, and the brilliance of the writing is that he's not a cartoon villain, not a screaming abuser, he's calm, considerate, soft-spoken, the kind of man everyone would tell you is a good catch, someone whose violence is almost entirely emotional, hidden in the way he constantly brings conversations back to his own efforts, his own sacrifices, reminding Siska that he took her in when she was lost, that his family gave her a future when she had nothing. Those phrases sliding in like poisoned honey, and you can imagine how easily someone like Siska, who is already unsure of her own memories, could begin to believe that narrative, could start to see her own past as something shameful, ungrateful to revisit, which is why the scenes where she starts to push back, even just a little, land like explosions, like when she returns late from seeing Uni and he asks, very calmly, where she's been. And instead of offering a quick lie, she just says, jalan-jalan, just wandering. And the silence that follows is deafening, the air thick with the realization that she has done something outside the script for the very first time. These character dynamics work so well on screen because the film is shot in a way that constantly traps or releases them visually depending on where they are and who they are with. In the mansion, the camera often frames Siska in wide shots where she looks small, swallowed by architecture and furniture, gliding from room to room like a ghost in a museum, and the color palette is all muted creams and gentle golds, kind of palette that screams, calm, but slowly starts to feel suffocatingly bland, unnatural in its lack of chaos, whereas with Uni, in the cramped Costco's in the noisy streets, the camera moves closer, handheld, jittery, giving you tight close-ups filled with sweat, tears, stray hairs, things out of focus in the background. A visual language that says, this is messy but this is alive. And there's a stunning sequence midway through the film where Siska spends a full day with Uni in her world, eating at a roadside warung, riding a crowded bus, getting caught in the rain without a car waiting, and for the first time the film's sound design really opens up. You hear honks, overlapping conversations, the call to prayer in the distance, frying oil hissing, all the noise that the mansion carefully muffles out, and Siska's face, as she takes it all in, is a miracle of acting. She looks overwhelmed but also strangely peaceful, like every sound is a reminder that she exists in a place that doesn't need her to be perfect to welcome her. On a purely cinematic level, Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian is so confident in its craft that you almost don't notice how precisely it's guiding your emotions, using repetition and contrast with surgical precision, like the recurring motif of doors, the heavy, automatically locking gate of the mansion, the thin wooden door of Uni's room that never quite shuts properly, the sliding glass door of a cafe where they meet halfway through the story, reflections of traffic and trees overlapping their faces as they talk, creating a literal visual metaphor of worlds colliding on their skin. The editing, too, plays with loops and breaks, cutting from Siska's repetitive routines to Uni's unpredictable days, sometimes intercutting them to the beat of a ticking clock, making you feel the divergence of their lives even before Siska physically starts to move between those spaces, and it's no coincidence that the film's pacing feels slow at first, almost languid, before picking up momentum as Siska's awareness grows, like her perception is literally speeding up, noticing more, resisting more, and with that shift, the score changes as well. Early on it's all gentle piano and strings, undramatic, almost like a spa playlist, but gradually, under certain scenes, a subtle discordant note intrudes, a low, sustained tone that your ears pick up on even if you don't consciously register it, making your stomach twist as something off creeps into even the most beautifully lit moments. What's powerful about the emotional journey here is that the film never lies to you about the stakes, it never pretends that choosing freedom will magically fix everything, and it certainly doesn't sell you the fantasy that love alone, whether romantic, queer, platonic, or otherwise, is enough to undo a lifetime of conditioning and external pressure. Instead it leans into the uncomfortable truth that sometimes love is the reason people stay in cages, because being adored, or at least being told you are, can feel safer than stepping out into the unknown, which is why the title is so important. Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian, not love but escape. It's not saying that love isn't real or valuable. It's saying that what we often call love is sometimes just the prettiest sell we're handed, and that the urgent, dangerous act isn't to love or be loved, but to run, to flee the narrative that keeps you small, even if you have to sprint into a future that might be colder, lonelier, or materially harder. It's in the third act that this idea comes crashing down, and this is where we're getting into heavier spoiler territory, so if you're listening and you haven't seen the film yet but you're already intrigued by everything I'm saying, you might want to pause here, watch the movie, and then come back, because from this point on we're diving into what really happened to Siska, what she's running from, and why her story with Uni is less a sweet romance and more a war story between two women and the invisible systems that try to erase them. So, with that warning out of the way, let's talk about the reveal that reframes everything before it. We learn, through a combination of fragmented flashbacks and a tense conversation between Siska and her future mother-in-law, that Siska didn't simply forget her past, it was taken from her, not through some sci-fi device or magic, but through a calculated emotional breakdown orchestrated under the guise of care, after her relationship with Uni was discovered by her conservative family and, crucially, by the man who is now her fiancé, who at the time was a distant cousin and family friend, hovering around the edges of her life like a patient opportunist, the one who always had a solution, always had advice, always knew a better way for her to live. When Siska and Uni's relationship came to light, the reaction wasn't explosive disownment but something more insidious: concern, endless concern, suggestions of therapy, of healing retreats, of getting away from the bad influence, and the film shows us glimpses of this in a muted, almost dreamlike visual style: rooms with pastel walls, counselors with soft voices, Siska in oversized hoodies looking smaller and smaller, and through overlapping voiceovers we hear phrases like, "Same-sex attraction is just a phase, we just want what's best for you. You will thank us one day," and buried in all that is the fiancé's voice, the same calm tone we've come to recognize, saying things like, "I'll wait as long as you need, I don't mind if you hate me now, one day you'll see this was love," and as an audience member you just sit there, your skin crawling, Recognizing the exact manipulative script of people who weaponize patience and devotion to justify erasing who you are, the film never trivializes this process. It doesn't montage through it as a quick explanation, it dwells in it, makes you feel how months of that kind of soft pressure can break someone, can make them doubt their own desires, until one day Siska, exhausted and numb, says, okay, fine, not because she's convinced but because she's tired of fighting, and that, okay, becomes the hinge on which her whole life swings, the consent that everyone else points to later as proof that she chose this, when in reality it was more like someone sinking beneath a wave saying, I give up, and calling it swimming. That's the horror at the heart of Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian, the idea that what looks like a dream life from the outside is sometimes just the endpoint of controlled collapse, and that Uni, watching all this happen from the margins, the ex who isn't allowed in the hospital room, the one who gets blocked, restrained, dismissed as the bad influence, had to choose her own survival too, had to let Siska go at some point just to stay sane, but couldn't fully move on because she never got to have a real goodbye, just a door slammed shut in her face by people who said Siska was healing inside. When Siska starts to remember fragments of this under the pressure of her renewed contact with Uni, the film's visual style fractures beautifully, mirrors, reflective surfaces, overlapping shots of her in two different versions of the same space, one with Uni, one with her fiancé, conversations where the dialogue from one timeline bleeds into the other, making you feel the disorientation of someone realizing that their memories have been rearranged, censored, recontextualized by others, and the single most gut-punching scene, in my opinion, is when Siska, back in the mansion dining room, looks at her future mother-in-law and asks, Waktu aku di tempat rehabilitasi itu, kalian pernah tanya aku maunya apa? Back then, when I was at that rehabilitation place, did any of you ever ask what I wanted? And the older woman stutters, genuinely confused by the question, because in her mind, wanting and needing are things that get decided by elders for the younger ones, and she tries to answer with, we knew you weren't well enough to decide, and in that sentence you can hear centuries of paternalism, of benevolent control, of families who believe love gives them the right to override autonomy, and Siska, for the first time in the film, doesn't fold, doesn't soften it, she just murmurs, then it wasn't love, and gets up from the table, leaving her untouched plate behind, a simple action that feels like a revolution, like she's finally taking herself off the menu of other people's expectations. What's remarkable is that even as the film exposes all this, it resists the urge to make any one person the singular villain, because the fiancé, the mother-in-law, Siska's own parents in the brief flashbacks we see of them, they are all products of the same system that teaches them control is care, that deviation is danger, that the highest form of love is sacrifice, usually someone else's, and in several moments the camera lingers on the fiancé's face as he watches Siska grow more distant, more questioning, and you can see the genuine panic there, the way he's terrified of losing her not just because he won her but because he truly does believe that without him she would plunge back into chaos, that the part of her that loved Uni was a sickness that he helped her cure, and that twisted sincerity makes him, in some ways, even scarier than if he were outright cruel, because it reflects a reality so many people know. The hardest cages to escape are the ones where the jailer honestly thinks he's saving you. Thematically, then, the film is juggling a lot: queer love in a conservative context, the politics of memory and consent, the difference between help and control, the idea of Pelarian, not just as running away physically but as an act of mental and emotional defiance, and it manages to weave all of this together without ever feeling didactic, largely because it anchors everything in Siska and Uni's very specific, very lived-in relationship. Their scenes together are where the movie breathes, where its philosophical questions become flesh, whether it's in quiet nights where they lie on Uni's thin mattress and talk about futures they can't name out loud, or in present-day arguments where Uni accuses Siska of wanting to have it both ways, to keep the safety of her new life while also rekindling their connection in secret, and Siska fires back that Uni doesn't understand what it's like to be the one whose mind was turned into a battlefield, who can't trust her own memories. And somewhere in all that shouting is the truth: they are both right and both wrong, because trauma has no clean edges, no fair distribution of blame, and the film honors that by refusing to give them an easy reconciliation. Instead, what it offers in its final act is something far more radical and, to some audiences, maybe even unsatisfying in the best possible way, not a lover's reunion under the sunset, but a joint decision by two women to step out of every script written for them, including the script of the tragic, doomed romance, and to walk into the unknown as separate people who will always be linked by what they survived, whether or not they end up holding hands. The turning point for that decision comes in a quietly devastating scene near the end, where Siska and Uni, after a particularly brutal confrontation with Siska's fiancé, who has finally cracked, raising his voice, demanding she choose once and for all, end up on a rooftop overlooking the city, slightly drunk, exhausted, watching the lights flicker on and off in the apartment blocks around them, and Uni says, "Kalau hidup cuma nanya, kamu milih siapa, tiras, kapek, sis, if life is just constantly asking, who do you choose, it's exhausting," and Siska, tears on her cheeks, laughs bitterly and replies, "Padahal pertanyaan yang benar, kamu milih jadi siapa, kan?" When the real question should be, who do you choose to be, right? And in that exchange you feel the entire thesis of the film crystallize, the shift away from love as the central axis of a woman's life, towards selfhood as the more urgent, more dangerous choice, and the next morning, without dramatic music or big speeches, Siska starts to pack a small bag, not a grand suitcase, not a cinematic stack of boxes, just a backpack with some clothes, the phone that has become both her tether and her prison, and a worn-out notebook she found among Uni's things that she doesn't remember ever writing in but feels compelled to bring, maybe hoping it contains a version of herself she can meet again. The film stays painfully grounded about what this escape means. There is no secret inheritance, no job waiting on the other side, no guarantee that her family will ever speak to her again. And that's where the title comes into sharp focus again. This is not love, this is escape, and escape is messy. It breaks things, it hurts people, it leaves loose ends and unresolved apologies, and the movie doesn't shy away from showing that, especially in a scene where Siska visits her parents one last time before she leaves, and her mother, rather than tearing her clothes or wailing, just sits there, quiet, exhausted, and says, "Mama kapek jadi orang jahat di cerita kamu. I'm tired of being the villain in your story," and Siska, with newfound clarity, replies softly, "Then stop playing the role." Not as a mic drop, not even with anger, but with a simple plea that her mother step out of the script as well, and the camera lingers on the older woman's face, caught between her own upbringing and the daughter in front of her, and for a second you think she might do it, might turn into an ally, but the film is honest, she doesn't, she just turns away, and that, too, is part of escape, accepting that not everyone will come with you. By the time Siska and Uni actually part ways physically, on a bus station platform bathed in harsh fluorescent light, there is no melodramatic kiss, no scream, no chase, just an exchange of looks and a tight, aching hug, each of them shaking with a different flavor of fear, and Uni's final line to Siska, which hit me like a punch, is, "Kalau suatu hari kamu bahagia, jangan lupa itu bukan karena mereka. If one day you're happy, don't forget it's not because of them," a line that flips the usual narrative of gratitude on its head, reminding Siska, and us, that escaping isn't about looking back and thanking your captors for making you strong, it's about claiming every future joy as something you fought for yourself, even when others told you they were the architects of your happiness. Cinematically, the film ends not with closure but with motion, Siska on a bus, face half reflected in the window, city lights blurring past, no music, just the hum of the engine and distant traffic, and then, in a small but powerful gesture, she deletes a folder on her phone labeled, "Wedding Plans," not angrily, not ceremoniously, just quietly, then opens the notes app and starts typing a new list, the camera zooming in just enough for us to see the title, "Things I Like," and then cutting away before we see a single item, because that list is not for us, not for Uni, not for any love interest, it's for her. An interior inventory that signals the beginning of a life where she isn't just responding to what others want from her, and when the screen finally fades to black, you're left not with the satisfaction of a wrapped-up story, but with a kind of gnawing, electric unease, as if the film has just handed you a mirror and walked away, letting you figure out what parts of your own life feel suspiciously like that too-perfect bedroom in the opening scene, what routines you're following that you never really chose, what loves have been labeled Pelarian or wrong, because they didn't fit someone else's script, and that's where Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian transcends being just a movie and becomes something closer to a quiet revolution in narrative form, especially in the context of Indonesian and wider Southeast Asian media where queer stories, when they appear at all, are often framed through tragedy, punishment, or as side plots overshadowed by heteronormative arcs. What this film does differently is it refuses to make queerness itself the tragedy, instead it frames the real horror as the coercive mechanisms that try to correct it, and the real triumph not as a perfect queer romance but as two queer women insisting on existing as full human beings, with or without each other, outside of anyone's redemptive arc. In terms of audience reaction, this kind of ending was always going to be divisive, and that's exactly what happened. There were viewers who desperately wanted Siska and Uni to ride off into some kind of sunset together, to get at least one unambiguously happy queer ending on screen, and I understand that hunger completely, because representation has been so scarce and so punishing for so long that any scrap of joy feels precious. But there were also viewers who appreciated the film's uncompromising stance, its refusal to let love, any love, be the band-aid that covers over structural problems, and if you scroll through comments and discussions, you'll see long threads of people debating whether Siska owed Uni more loyalty, whether Uni was right to push her, whether the fiancé deserved any sympathy, whether the parents' fear was understandable, and that, to me, is the mark of a film that did something right. It didn't hand you neat villains and heroes, it handed you a situation that looks uncomfortably like real life, where everyone thinks they are doing what's best in a world that has taught them warped definitions of best and love. And it forced you to sit with that complexity rather than resolving it for you, culturally. Bukan Cinta. Pelarian also taps into a broader conversation happening not just in Indonesia but across the world, about how much of what we call care is actually control, how often mental health language gets hijacked by families to justify keeping people in line, how concern becomes a leash, and wanting you to be safe becomes excluding you from your own decision-making, and the film does this in such a specifically local way, through details like the rehab center's religious posters, the aunties' gossip at family gatherings, the economic reality of choosing to leave a wealthy situation for a precarious one, that it feels both like a sharp critique of its own context and a story that resonates far beyond it. It's also worth mentioning how rare it still is to see two women at the center of a film like this, not as rivals, not as foils to a male protagonist, but as full, complicated leads whose inner lives drive the entire narrative, and how quietly radical it feels to watch scene after scene where they talk not just about love and pain, but about work, money, boredom, silly memes, childhood dreams, all the things that make people whole beyond their romantic storylines. Performance-wise, the actors playing Siska and Uni carry this film on their shoulders in a way that's nothing short of astounding. Siska's journey from dazed compliance to fragile defiance is mapped out not through big speeches but through micro-expressions, hesitations before she says yes, the way her posture slowly shifts from hunched to grounded, the way her eyes change when she looks at herself in the mirror, from seeing a stranger to seeing someone whose face she's beginning to recognize again, while Uni's combination of toughness and vulnerability shows up in how she navigates her own survival, taking extra shifts, making jokes at her own expense, deflecting concern with sarcasm, then breaking down alone in the bathroom. And the chemistry between them isn't just sexual or romantic, it's layered with history, with the weird, awkward comfort of people who know each other's worst habits and still show up. And that dynamic sells the idea that what's at stake here isn't simply, will they end up together, but, will they both end up as themselves? Pacing-wise, I'll be honest, if you're someone who prefers your narratives fast and snappy, with constant plot twists and obvious emotional beats, this film might test your patience, especially in the first half, because it really does commit to showing the suffocating repetition of Siska's perfect life before allowing any cracks to show. There are scenes that feel, intentionally, like déjà vu, another brunch, another car ride, another polite exchange in a designer kitchen, and you might find yourself wondering where it's all heading, but that's precisely the point. The monotony is part of the prison, and the film is asking you not just to observe it but to feel it in your own body, to get restless, to crave something different, so that when the first genuine disruption arrives, Uni's voice note, a missed step in the fiancé's perfectly timed routine, it hits you with multiplied force. By the time the story starts accelerating, you've earned it, you've lived in that cage long enough that the smallest gestures of rebellion feel seismic, and that's a really hard tonal balance to pull off, but the director and editor manage it with a kind of quiet confidence that I really admire. I also want to highlight how the film uses technology, not as a flashy plot device, but as an everyday artifact of how our lives and identities are recorded and erased. It's through her phone that Siska first reconnects with Uni, but it's also on her phone that entire years of their shared history are missing, photos deleted, chats cleared, call logs wiped clean, and the only proof that something used to be there are these empty gaps in the timeline, these stretches where the metadata says, no data, like a scar on otherwise smooth skin. And there's a particularly haunting Moment where Siska sits alone at night scrolling backwards through her gallery, watching herself go from the woman she is now to younger, looser versions of herself, until she hits a wall. No more pictures, just a blank space between timestamps, and you can see in her face the horror of realizing that someone somewhere hit select all and delete on a whole chapter of her life. Contrast that with Uni's cracked phone screen spiderwebbed, where their old photos still live, glitchy, sometimes refusing to load, but stubbornly there. And the film makes this quiet but potent statement about who gets to be the archivist of your life, who gets to hold your memories, and how dangerous it is when you hand that power entirely to people who claim to know what's best for you. If we zoom out a bit and think of Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian not just as one story but as part of a broader wave of media that's interrogating the idea of the good life, beyond material success and traditional relationships, it fits quite perfectly alongside films and series from around the world that question the cult of stability, the weaponization of happiness as a social control tool, and the myth that safety and freedom are always compatible. But what makes this film stand out, at least to me, is the specificity of its cultural texture, the way you can almost smell the incense in the family's prayer room, hear the nationalism-laced motivational speeches of school assemblies echoing in the characters' heads, taste the cheap Kopi sachet Uni drinks while doom scrolling at 2 a.m., and those grounded details prevent it from ever feeling like an abstract metaphor. It's rooted in a living, breathing Indonesia, with all its contradictions, ambitions, and anxieties, and that rootedness matters, because it turns what could have been a universal but vague parable into a story that actually talks to the community that most needs to hear it, while still inviting global audiences to find their own resonances in it. Ultimately, the question you might be asking yourself is, does Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian work as a movie night pick? Is it enjoyable, or is it one of those films that you respect more than you like? And for me the answer is complicated in the best way, because I wouldn't call it light viewing, I wouldn't put it on as background noise while scrolling through your phone. It demands your attention, your patience, your emotional participation, and in return it offers something that's rarer and rarer in our content-saturated world. A story that doesn't underestimate you, that doesn't assume you want everything spoon-fed, that trusts you to sit with ambiguity, to handle discomfort, to recognize yourself in flawed, hurting people, and to carry their questions with you after the credits instead of leaving them in the theater. Emotionally, my verdict is this: Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian is less a film you like or dislike, and more a film you end up in conversation with, sometimes arguing, sometimes nodding, sometimes flinching as it echoes back parts of your own life you weren't ready to revisit. And if you're someone who has ever felt your choices being made for you under the banner of love, if you've ever looked at the life you're living and thought, who picked this for me? If you've ever stayed in a situation that looked perfect on the outside while slowly choking on the inside, then this movie will feel like it's sitting down next to you at 3 in the morning and saying, I see you, and you're not crazy for wanting to run. And that, to me, is the highest compliment I can give it. It doesn't romanticize escape, it doesn't glorify suffering, it doesn't hand you a new idol to worship, it just tells the truth about how hard it is to step out of the stories others have written for you, and how necessary that step is if you ever want to write your own. So if you're considering watching it, go in ready to feel uncomfortable, ready to pause and rewind, ready to maybe take a walk after, and if you've already seen it and you're still trying to categorize it as romance, as drama, as queer cinema, as social critique, maybe let go of the need to label it for a moment and just sit with what it stirred up in you, because that's where its real power lies, not in how it fits into genres or trends, but in how it quietly rearranges the furniture inside your mind, pushing you to ask, in your own language, in your own life, what here is really love, and what here is just a very pretty prison I've been taught to say thank you for. There are movies that hold your hand, tell you where to look, and send you home with a neat little moral. And then there are movies that feel like you woke up in someone else's life with your shoes already on, your name already spoken by strangers, your smile already expected. And Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian is that second kind, the kind that doesn't ask for your attention so much as it kidnaps it. Because from the very first minutes it poses a quiet, terrifying question: what if the world finally gives you everything that's supposed to make you happy, and it still feels like a locked room with velvet walls? Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, this story arrives stamped with 2025 on its forehead, and even if you go in with only the title and a vague sense of romance drama, the film, or series, depending on how you experience it, quickly reveals it's not interested in the easy comfort of being a love story, it's interested in the anatomy of escape, in how people slip out of cages that don't look like cages, in how perfect can be another word for controlled, and that idea is baked right into the first image of Siska's new reality. She wakes up in a world that is too clean, too quiet, too expensive, too composed, like the air itself has been ironed, and the strangest thing about it isn't the luxury, it's the silence behind it, the sense that somebody has staged her life the way you stage a showroom, beautiful angles, glossy surfaces, nothing out of place, and absolutely nowhere to breathe. The storyline, on paper, sounds deceptively simple. Siska awakens in an unfamiliar perfection and meets Uni, a friend whose own heartache has curdled into something darker, and together they discover the truth. This isn't a story about being loved, it's about surviving, and yet the way the narrative unfolds makes that simplicity feel like a trapdoor, because every scene is designed to make you question what real even means when reality is curated by someone else's desires. What I love about how the film introduces Siska is that it doesn't rush to explain her, it lets her be disoriented, and that disorientation becomes ours. She's not waking up like a hero in a fantasy, she's waking up like a person whose memories are intact but whose context has been stolen, and the camera, at least in spirit, in the way the storytelling frames her, stays just close enough to feel the panic she's swallowing. It's an unsettling kind of calm. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of being watched. The rooms are spacious, the light is soft, and yet it all lands as claustrophobic because the world is too perfect to be called real, and that line is not just a description, it's a warning label. When perfection shows up uninvited, someone else paid for it, and the bill usually comes due in obedience. From there, the story pulls in Uni, and Uni is such an important counterweight because she represents another form of imprisonment, not the gilded cage of wealth and roleplay, but the sticky, humiliating cage of one-sided love, the kind where you keep shrinking yourself into whatever shape you think might finally be chosen. Uni's dark side isn't that she's evil, it's that she has been trained by longing to accept crumbs as meals, to interpret pain as proof of devotion, and when the film lets us see how that kind of love bends a person, it doesn't do it with melodramatic speeches, it does it with patterns, with repetition, with the exhaustion of realizing you've been auditioning for affection in a play that never needed you. And what's brilliant is that Siska and Uni aren't presented as opposites so much as reflections in different mirrors. Siska is trapped in a role she didn't choose, Uni is trapped in a feeling she can't stop choosing, and both of those traps are fueled by the same engine, the idea that a woman's purpose is something assigned, not something authored. That's why the title hits so hard once you're in it, not love but escape. Because the story keeps confronting you with this cruelly common misconception that if a woman is surrounded by comfort, or surrounded by attention, or surrounded by someone who wants her, then she must be okay. The film dismantles that misconception scene by scene, showing how attention can be surveillance, how comfort can be sedative, how being wanted can be a form of being owned. And this is where I want to talk about the spoiler-controlled overview in a way that still respects the experience. The plot doesn't hinge on a single twist so much as a gradual unveiling, like fog lifting from a landscape you didn't realize you were lost in. Siska starts noticing fractures in the perfection, small inconsistencies, moments where the script of her life feels pre-written, where people respond not to who she is but to who she's supposed to be. It's the feeling of walking into a conversation halfway through and everyone acts like you said something you never said. And as she tries to ground herself, Uni becomes both ally and cautionary tale. Their friendship is the emotional spine of the story, and it's refreshing, honestly, because so many narratives would turn these two women into rivals or moral opposites, but here, the bond is messy, tender, sometimes sharp, and always human. They disagree, they protect each other, they trigger each other, they force each other to see truths that hurt. And the more they push against the boundaries of their roles, the clearer it becomes that love, in this world, is often a costume worn by control. People say the right things, do the romantic gestures, speak in the language of destiny, and yet the effect is constriction, not expansion. The film is deeply interested in that contradiction, the way love is supposed to make you more yourself, but in certain hands it becomes a tool to make you less. Now, character impressions, because this is where the project really lives or dies, and Siska is written with a kind of quiet defiance that I found incredibly affecting. She isn't defiant in the loud, cinematic way where she delivers a speech and storms out, she's defiant in the way she keeps asking, even when nobody wants her to ask, why am I here? Who decided this? What happens if I say no? There's a steadiness in her confusion, like she refuses to let her fear turn into surrender. And there's something painfully relatable in that, because so many people know what it's like to live inside expectations that don't match their insides, to smile through a life that looks good in photos and feels wrong in the bones. Uni, on the other hand, is the character who breaks your heart in a slower way, because her struggle isn't just external, it's internalized. She's been living with the consequences of loving someone who doesn't love her back, and the film doesn't reduce that to, she's naive. It shows how one-sided love can become an entire identity, how it can wrap around your daily decisions, your self-image, your tolerance for disrespect. Uni's darkness is the darkness of compromise, the darkness of telling yourself, this is enough, until you forget what enough ever felt like. And when Siska and Uni are on screen together, the film finds its most electric energy, not action energy, but emotional electricity, the kind that snaps when a truth is too close to ignore. Their conversations feel like two people trying to save each other while also trying not to drown. Now, let's get cinematic, because the atmosphere here is doing a lot of storytelling without ever announcing itself. The film's sense of space is purposeful, wide rooms that somehow feel smaller than a bedroom, hallways that look like they lead somewhere but emotionally lead nowhere, windows that offer light but not freedom. That neat silence, in the summary, isn't just an aesthetic, it's a psychological tactic. Silence can be peace, but it can also be suppression, and here it often plays like a muzzle. When the world is too quiet, you hear your thoughts too loudly, and that's dangerous when the world you're in depends on you not thinking too much. The luxury is foreign, and that word matters, because luxury in this story isn't aspirational, it's alienating. It's the kind of wealth that doesn't feel like comfort because it comes with rules, and the rules come with the unspoken threat of exile. The most effective scenes, for me, are the ones where the film lets the camera linger on normal actions, Siska standing still too long, Uni hesitating before answering a simple question, because those hesitations are where control becomes visible. It's like watching someone test the bars of a cage by pretending to stretch. And emotionally, the film has this pulse of dread that never fully goes away, even in its softer moments, because it understands something true: you can be surrounded by beauty and still feel unsafe if your autonomy is missing. Themes, too, are layered in a way that feels lived in rather than lectured. The biggest theme is freedom, not the Instagram version of freedom where you quit your job and travel, but the real version where you reclaim the right to define yourself even if it costs you comfort, approval, and the illusion of security. Another theme is performance, and I don't mean acting on a stage, I mean the daily performance of being who people want you to be. Siska is forced into a role she never chose, and the film treats that role like a script. There are lines she's expected to say, feelings she's expected to have, gratitude she's expected to perform. That's why love becomes a mask here, because it's not about connection, it's about compliance. When someone says, I love you, but what they mean is, I like the version of you I can control, love stops being love and starts being a contract written in invisible ink. Uni's side of the story explores another mask, the mask of devotion, the way a person can call it love when it's really fear of abandonment, fear of being alone, fear of admitting you invested years in someone who never invested back. The film doesn't shame her for that, it mourns it. It shows how easy it is to confuse intensity with intimacy, persistence with destiny. And when the two women begin to understand that their situations are connected by the same underlying machine, that's when the narrative clicks into something bigger than personal drama. It becomes a story about systems, social, emotional, maybe even literal systems depending on how you interpret the too perfect world, and how those systems are maintained by convincing people that the cage is romance, that the leash is a promise, that surrender is maturity. Performances, again, speaking without naming specific actors because the prompt doesn't give them, feel tuned to restraint. This story would collapse if the acting went too big, because the horror here is subtle. It's the horror of being gently erased. So the best moments are micro-moments, a flicker of anger swallowed, a smile that arrives half a second late, a breath held too long. You can feel the characters calculating risk in real time, and that's a hard thing to sell. The pacing is also interesting because it dares to be patient, and that patience is part of the experience. Some viewers will call it slow, but I think slow is only a problem when nothing is happening, and here, something is always happening. it's just happening internally, in realizations, in shifting loyalties, in the gradual redefinition of what the characters will and won't tolerate. The plot moves like someone quietly packing a bag in the middle of the night, careful, quiet, determined, terrified of being heard. There's also an emotional escalation that feels honest. The film doesn't pretend that choosing freedom is a single heroic act. It shows it as a sequence of smaller betrayals against the system that raised you, telling the truth once, refusing to apologize once, walking away once, and then doing it again the next day when the guilt tries to drag you back. And that brings me to the heart of it. This is not a story about victims or heroes, and the summary says that plainly, but the film earns it. Siska and Uni are not saintly, and that's crucial. They make choices that are messy. They hurt each other sometimes. They misjudge people. They hesitate when you wish they'd run. But that messiness is the point, because the film is arguing that freedom is a human desire, not a heroic badge, and you don't need to be perfect to deserve your own life. I also want to talk about how the film uses the concept of escape without glamorizing it. Escape is not framed as a romantic getaway, it's framed as a survival mechanism, the last open door in a room that keeps shrinking. And there's a haunting ambiguity in the idea of where, exactly, they are escaping from. On one level, it's clearly from relationships and expectations that have turned poisonous. On another level, it feels like escaping from narratives themselves, from the stories society writes for women: be chosen, be grateful, be quiet, be beautiful, be loyal, be everything, and if you're miserable, call it love so nobody has to change. The film keeps asking, what if the happy ending everyone wants for you is actually the ending of you? And the way it visualizes that, through repetition, through pristine settings, through the discomfort of politeness, makes the message land without preaching. Now, audience reaction and cultural impact. Obviously I can't speak for every viewer, and I'm not going to pretend I have a spreadsheet of reactions, but I can tell you the kind of story this is tends to hit a nerve, especially in cultures and communities where appearances carry heavy weight, where a woman's life is often evaluated by how settled she looks rather than how safe she feels. Stories like this invite conversation because they force people to separate love from possession, devotion from self-erasure, and that separation is uncomfortable. If you've ever seen people argue online about a character owing someone affection because they were provided for, then you already understand the cultural pressure this film is pushing back against. I can easily imagine viewers splitting into camps, those who want Siska to just accept the perfect life because it looks like success, and those who understand that success without choice is just another word for captivity. And Uni's arc, especially, is the kind that makes people look at their own friendships differently, because it's not just about romance, it's about how often we watch someone we love accept less than they deserve and we don't know how to pull them out without breaking trust. The film doesn't offer easy slogans. It offers a mirror. And because it's a story centered on two women choosing themselves, not as a trend, not as a punchline, but as a painful act of reclamation, it carries a quiet power that lingers after the credits. You keep thinking about the moments where the characters almost go back, almost apologize for wanting freedom, almost accept the mask again. That's real. That's what makes this story feel like it's about Bertahan, surviving, rather than about winning. Even the title feels like it's challenging the audience. Stop calling it love if it looks like a cage. Stop romanticizing endurance when it's actually slow harm. Stop telling people to be grateful for a life they never chose. By the time you reach the later stretches of the narrative, the tension isn't just, will they get out? It's, what will it cost them internally to admit they were trapped, because leaving a cage is one thing, but unlearning the cage is another. The film understands that trauma can become familiar, and familiarity can feel like home, and that's why people stay. That's why Uni's one-sided love is so heartbreaking, because it's familiar, and familiarity can be seductive when you're tired. That's why Siska's perfect world is so creepy, because it's comfortable, and comfort can be used as a muzzle when it's conditional. And through all of that, the film keeps its empathy. It doesn't demonize desire. It doesn't demonize love. It demonizes the way love is weaponized. It shows how people can hide cruelty behind care, how they can call control, protection, how they can call surveillance, worry, how they can call isolation, keeping you safe. Those are the most dangerous lies because they sound like tenderness. If I had to give you my emotional verdict, it would be this: Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian is the kind of watch that leaves you quieter afterward, not because it's depressing, but because it's clarifying. It takes the glossy language we use, perfect, lucky, chosen, loved, and it scratches it until you see what's underneath: the need to be free, the right to say no, the courage to disappoint the people who benefit from your obedience. It's a story about two women stepping out of assigned destinies, and the film doesn't frame that step as a triumphal march, it frames it as what it really is: shaky, costly, necessary. And if you're the kind of viewer who loves narratives that trust you to feel complicated things at the same time, fear and relief, grief and anger, tenderness and disgust, then this one is going to land. It's not a comfort watch, but it is a validating one, because it insists on a truth that too many stories avoid. Being desired is not the same as being valued, being provided for is not the same as being respected, and love, real love, doesn't demand you disappear to prove you deserve it. In the end, what stays with me isn't a single twist or a single line, it's the image of two people recognizing that survival sometimes looks like betrayal to the world that profits from your silence, and choosing it anyway, choosing breath over beauty, choosing uncertainty over scripted safety, choosing escape not because they are weak, but because they are finally, painfully, fiercely awake. And because talking about Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian feels almost unfinished if we stop at just, "This is a good film," or "This made me emotional," I want to keep pulling at the threads this movie leaves hanging in your head, because it's the kind of story that doesn't just end when the runtime does, it keeps replaying in your mind in different ways depending on where you are in your own life, and that's one of the wildest things about it for me. The second time you watch it, it's almost a completely different film from the first, like a memory scene from another angle, because on your first watch you're right there with Siska, confused, suspicious, absorbing the mood more than the details, maybe not even fully catching all the hints that something is off, but on a rewatch, every tiny gesture, every throwaway line, every background object suddenly lights up like a red flag. You notice, for example, how early on there's a close-up of Siska looking through a drawer in the mansion, and her fingers pause just briefly on a stack of old medical receipts, stamped with a clinic name that later we realize is the rehab, where her queerness was pathologized, but in the moment it just feels like production design clutter, and the fact that your brain didn't clock it the first time is exactly what the film is playing with: our tendency to ignore the institutional traces of violence when they are framed as care, to see paperwork and hospital logos and assume good intentions, or how the fiancé's first big romantic gesture, arranging a surprise dinner with Siska's favorite food, is actually built on something we later understand is deeply creepy. He knows her preferences from a time when she was vulnerable and highly monitored, when she was basically stripped down and observed like a case study, and that knowledge, which could have been intimate, becomes invasive, like a souvenir he took from her trauma and turned into a romantic prop. That rewatch perspective is where the film really flexes its writing muscles, showing you that it wasn't just going for vibes, it was laying out a breadcrumb trail from the very beginning, trusting you to either catch it or come back for it later. And that kind of layered construction is part of why it sticks. You start thinking about how many real-world stories work like that too, where only in hindsight do certain compliments, certain acts of love, certain protections, reveal themselves as controlling, and it makes you want to scan your own past for similar patterns, which is a pretty intense reaction to a movie. But that's exactly what this one is playing at. It's cinema that has an almost retroactive effect on your memories. And then there's the way the film treats men and masculinity, which I think is more complex than it might seem on the surface, because it would have been easy, even cathartic, to make the male characters outright monsters. But instead they're written as people shaped by the same expectations and fears that crush Siska and Uni, just in a different configuration. Take Siska's fiancé. On a purely performance level, the actor gives him this disarming warmth, this kind of everyman appeal. He laughs easily, he's polite to waiters, he remembers birthdays, and yet the camera, in those little off moments, chooses angles that show you his jaw clenching when Siska talks about wanting to figure herself out, his fingers tapping on the table when she doesn't answer him fast enough, tiny tensions that hint at the control freak under the nice guy shell. And that's such a specific kind of danger, the danger of men whose identities are built on being saviors, because saviors need you to stay broken to feel necessary. We also get glimpses of older male authority, the doctors, the religious counselors, the father figures, and they all share this calm conviction that they know what's best, that any resistance from Siska is just a symptom to be treated, not a boundary to be respected. And that's where the film is quietly searing, because it calls out a very real dynamic in many cultures where elders, especially male elders, are allowed to define reality for younger people in the name of tradition or religion or respect, and any deviation is cast as immaturity or rebellion, not legitimate self-discovery. But the movie doesn't just leave it at men bad, women good. It's smarter than that, because Siska's mother and future mother-in-law are absolutely complicit in the same system, sometimes even more fiercely so, policing Siska's behavior, smoothing over her doubts, repeating the mantras of, a good wife is patient, a mother knows her child better than she knows herself, phrases that sound loving but carry the weight of erasure. There's a scene where Siska's mom sits on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair, telling her how lucky she is to have a man who loves her enough to fight her demons, and the way it's shot, soft lighting, gentle touch, a lullaby humming in the background, completely opposes the actual content of what she's saying, and that dissonance makes your skin crawl, because you can see how dangerous love can be when it's tangled up with fear, when parents are so terrified of their children walking a different path that they'd rather break them into a shape that fits the mold. The generational angle here is huge, too, because the film doesn't shy away from showing the older characters as people who themselves were shaped, bruised, and coerced into their own roles, people who might genuinely believe there is no other way to survive in the world than to conform, and that nuance is crucial. You're allowed to feel angry at them and also mourn for the parts of themselves they sacrificed before they even had the language to name what they lost, which brings me to another thing I love about Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian. It refuses to flatten queerness into just a label or a plot twist. It treats it as an entire ecosystem of longing, compromise, and survival strategies, and it understands that for Siska and Uni, being attracted to each other isn't some novelty, it's a deep, everyday reality that shapes how they move through the world, from the small ways they censor themselves in public to the big, life-altering decisions about where they can safely live, work, or even hold hands. The film doesn't exploit their intimacy for shock value, either. There are tender scenes, yes, and physical closeness, but the framing is always about their connection, their safety, their emotional weather, not about voyeuristic titillation, and that's so important, because it shows them as full people first, not as representatives of an issue, or as objects of the male gaze. One detail that stayed with me is how the film uses something as simple as hair to trace Siska's queerness and its suppression. In the flashbacks with Uni, her hair is shorter, messier, often tied up carelessly, almost like a visual shorthand for freedom and practicality. In the present, perfect life, her hair is long, carefully styled, always immaculate, a kind of curtain she hides behind, and there's a scene late in the film where she stands in the bathroom, scissors in hand, contemplating cutting it, and you can feel the weight of that choice. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about reclaiming a body that's been dressed and arranged for the benefit of others. And ultimately she doesn't do it in that moment, which I love, because it shows that healing and self-ownership don't always show up as dramatic, cinematic transformations. Sometimes they show up as tiny, private acts like buying a t-shirt that actually feels like you, or writing that things I like list we talked about earlier. And speaking of lists, I can't help but think about how this film would resonate with an audience like the one we have here on Bongo Gaming, because gaming is, at its core, about choices, about navigating worlds that give you certain paths and seeing what happens if you try to step off the rails, and a film like this is basically a no-combat, all-dialogue, psychological RPG in movie form. Imagine a visual novel where your dialogue options are constantly pushed towards, be grateful, stay safe, don't upset anyone, and somewhere hidden in there is this one fragile option that says, ask what you actually want, and picking that option doesn't give you +10 happiness, it gives you +10 chaos, +10 uncertainty, but maybe also +10 authenticity, and the game never tells you if you made the good choice, because the whole point is that there is no fixed morality meter when it comes to your own life. There's just the question of whether you can stand the person you are when you go to sleep at night. Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian doesn't gamify that, obviously, but it visualizes it in ways that gamers, especially those who love story-rich experiences, will probably vibe with. Branching paths that never fully close, NPCs who believe they're the main character, quest lines that don't resolve cleanly, and a protagonist whose win condition is not defeating a villain but refusing to play a rigged game. And while we're on the subject of structure and design, we have to talk more about the film's soundscape, because I mentioned the silence and the noise earlier, but the more I think about it, the more I appreciate how intentional those choices are. The mansion sound design is so minimal that it becomes oppressive, The kind of quiet where you start to hear your own heartbeat too loudly. Whereas Uni's world is filled with overlapping, frequently annoying sounds, neighbors arguing, scooters revving, kids yelling, and yet it feels so much more livable, more humane, because it's the sound of people being uncontained. One of the most quietly devastating audio moments for me is when Siska is lying in bed in the mansion and she thinks she hears Uni's laughter through the wall, faint, like a phantom, and she follows it, barefoot, down the hallway, opening door after door in this huge, echoing house, only to find empty guest rooms, storage, nothing, and then the laughter morphs seamlessly into the canned laughter of a sitcom playing on the TV in the living room, where her fiancé is watching, oblivious. The way that sound morphs from real to artificial without a cut captures in one moment how Siska's mind is trying to force something real into a space that only permits performance, and you feel that ache of searching for joy in a place where everything is staged. There's also a motif of rain throughout the film, not in a cliché, weepy romance way, but as a recurring threshold element. It rains the night Siska and Uni kiss for the first time in a flashback. It rains the day Siska decides to sneak out and find Uni in the present, and it rains lightly at the bus station in the final act, each time creating this sense of the world washing itself, blurring edges, asking, are you coming with the flow or are you going to stand still and get soaked? And Siska, who spends so much of the film staying dry under other people's umbrellas, finally chooses to walk into the drizzle without one at the end, hair getting damp, makeup smudging, and it's such a small, visual thing, but it speaks volumes about where she's at compared to the immaculately groomed doll we met at the start. On the critical side, because no film is perfect and it's worth talking about where Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian might not land for everyone, I do think some viewers will feel that the rehab arc, as crucial as it is, could have used a bit more explicit unpacking. There are implications of conversion therapy, of religiously framed counseling, of psychological manipulation, and while the film does a fantastic job of showing the emotional impact, some might wish it confronted the institutional aspect more directly, maybe showing more of the clinic's internal workings, how they justify themselves, who funds them, that sort of thing. But I would argue that part of the film's choice to stay with Siska's subjective experience, to keep those spaces hazy and dreamlike, is what allows it to focus on her trauma without turning her into a case study or the clinic into some dramatic movie villain lair. And there's an ethical dimension to that. The film isn't interested in giving screen time to the methodologies of harm, it's interested in centering the person harmed. And in a media landscape that often fetishizes the mechanics of abuse, that's a refreshing choice, even if it leaves some viewers curious for a more exposed style breakdown. Another potential sticking point is the pacing around the middle, where Siska is bouncing back and forth between the mansion and Uni's world, and some audience members might feel like the film lingers a bit too much on the will she won't she tension, with multiple near confessions and almost breakups that could feel repetitive if you're expecting a tight, snappy plot. But for me, that drawn-out indecision is exactly what makes it feel real, because in life, when you're contemplating a big, scary change, you do circle it over and over, you rehearse what you're going to say, you back out at the last minute, you try to keep one foot in each world until the stretch becomes unbearable. The film makes you sit in that uncomfortable limbo, and yes, it can be frustrating, but it also makes the eventual decision, Siska's choice to leave, not just a plot point but a hard-earned emotional cliff she's gotten to by crawling, not sprinting. We also can't ignore how bold it is for a 2025 Indonesian film to tell this story as directly as it does, even if some things are still couched in metaphor and suggestion. The cultural context here matters a lot. Queer narratives are still heavily policed, both legally and socially, and the fact that we get to see two women loving each other, breaking because of what the world does to them, and then choosing themselves, is the result of years of small battles fought by filmmakers, activists, viewers who supported indie stories, people who kept demanding to see their realities reflected on screen, and Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian exists in that lineage. It's a continuation of a slow, stubborn shift, one that probably had to make compromises we don't even fully see. Maybe certain scenes had to be toned down, certain words avoided, certain endings negotiated, but even within those constraints, the film finds ways to be piercingly honest, often through subtext, glances, silence, through what's not said as loudly as what is. For instance, there's never a big didactic speech where Siska declares her sexuality as an identity label. There's no neat, coming out, moment, and for some Western viewers that might feel like a lack, but in its own context, it's completely authentic. These women are living in a world where naming things directly can be dangerous. Where desire has to be coded in shared looks and inside jokes and the simple, radical act of choosing each other even when the language to describe that choice is contested or punishable. The film respects that complexity instead of imposing a more standardized narrative arc onto it, and I think that's one of its quiet strengths. Emotionally, what really lingers for me long after the film is not just specific scenes but a series of images that feel almost archetypal. Siska standing alone in a huge, echoing hallway, the camera slowly pulling back until she's just a tiny figure swallowed by space, Uni hunched over her phone in a noisy cafe, replaying an old voice note from Siska just to hear her laugh, even though it hurts. The way a simple bus ticket, crumpled and damp from the rain, becomes more meaningful than any of the diamond jewelry Siska owns, because it represents a path she actually chose, even if she doesn't know where it leads. And above all, that final, unseen list of things I like, an invitation for us to imagine Siska's future not as a pre-written script, not as a wedding program, but as an ongoing, evolving document she gets to edit as often as she wants. And I think that's what I want to leave you with if you've made it this far into this review. Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian is not a film that's trying to tell you, this is the right choice, or, this is how you should live. It's not prescribing rebellion for everyone or demonizing stability across the board. It's doing something far more intimate, which is handing you a mirror and a key at the same time, saying, only you know which parts of your life feel like love and which parts feel like a cage. But whatever you find when you look closely, you're allowed to reach for the door, and that's a terrifying permission to receive, because once you know you can leave, even just mentally, even just emotionally, you can't unknow it. You might stay for a while longer, for money, for kids, for fear, for habit, but that seed has been planted. That question will keep whispering in your ear. What if? And a film that can plant that kind of question in people's hearts is doing something more radical than 100 preachy monologues. It's not going to be a film for every mood. You might love your sweet, predictable rom-coms and your adrenaline-pumping blockbusters, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when you're in a season of your life where you're questioning things, where you're standing in a doorway between the life you know and the life you can't quite imagine yet, pressing play on Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian might feel less like entertainment and more like an unexpected companion, a story that sits beside you and admits, yeah, it's scary out there, but staying somewhere that's killing you slowly is its own kind of horror. And somehow, hearing that put into images, into dialogues, into the trembling of an actress's hands as she holds a bus ticket, can make your own fear feel a little less lonely. So if you've seen the movie, I'm genuinely curious which part burrowed under your skin the most. Was it a line, a shot, a choice Siska made that you're still arguing with, a moment where you wanted to yell at the screen because you've been there, or because you're terrified you might get there someday? And if you haven't seen it yet but stuck around through all this, maybe that says something too. Maybe some part of you recognizes yourself in the idea of a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels haunted from within. And if that's the case, I hope when you do watch it, you give yourself the space after to just sit, to not immediately scroll to the next video or bury the feeling, but to ask quietly, without judgment, where in my life am I living someone else's idea of love, and where am I actually alive? Because that, more than any box office number or award buzz, is where this film truly lives, in the quiet, uncomfortable, necessary questions it leaves behind in the people who dare to really watch it. And the more you sit with that awakening, the more the title stops feeling like a clever slogan and starts feeling like a diagnosis, because, not love but escape, isn't just what Siska and Uni are doing, it's what the story is asking us to admit we've seen 1,000 times in real life. People staying in rooms that hurt them because the room is decorated nicely, people calling a leash a necklace because it sparkles, people swallowing their own instincts because everyone around them keeps insisting, with a smile, that they should be grateful. And what makes this 2025 release feel timely is that it doesn't treat those instincts as melodrama, it treats them as intelligence, as the body's quiet alarm system, as something sacred that gets silenced long before someone ever dares to lock a door. If you're watching this as a viewer who's ever felt out of place inside, good fortune, you're going to recognize the way Siska's discomfort isn't loud at first, it's microscopic, it's the tiniest mismatch between what she's told and what she feels, the kind of mismatch you could almost gaslight yourself into ignoring, and that's the point, because the story understands that control rarely starts with chains, it starts with compliments. It starts with, this is for your own good. It starts with a soft voice that says, just relax, while quietly removing your options one by one. That's why the perfection around Siska feels like a threat, perfection means somebody is maintaining the image, and maintenance requires compliance, and compliance requires you to stop asking questions, and Siska, bless her, cannot stop asking, not even when the questions make everyone else's faces tighten for half a second like they're struggling to keep the mask from slipping. And then there's Uni, whose struggle is a different kind of maintenance, because one-sided love is its own full-time job. It has you editing yourself, rereading messages like they're scripture, turning silence into meaning, turning neglect into, they are just busy, turning disrespect into, I'm too sensitive, and the story positions Uni not as a cautionary stereotype, but as a person who has been trained into emotional hunger, and hunger makes you do things you'd never do on a full stomach. The friendship between them becomes the one place where the air isn't entirely staged, and you can feel how rare that is, how precious it is, because in a world that runs on scripts, friendship can be the only unscripted language left. And it's interesting, because the narrative doesn't treat friendship like a side dish to romance, it treats friendship like the raft. When love becomes a mask, when romance becomes performance, the honest look from a friend can feel like the first real sunrise you've seen in years. You start to see how the story is less interested in the question, who ends up with whom, and more interested in, who gets to be a person, and that's such a sharper, more adult question, because pairing off is easy to write, autonomy is harder, autonomy has consequences, autonomy forces you to confront the people who benefited from your silence. When the summary says Siska wakes up in a role she never chose, that role could mean a lot of things: wife, muse, trophy, caretaker, symbol, solution, and the story smartly keeps the role slightly abstract in the way it's felt rather than just stated, because the feeling is universal, being placed, being arranged, being assigned like furniture in someone else's house. And what's haunting is how quickly a human being can start adapting to that placement, how quickly you can start moving like the furniture moves, carefully, quietly, trying not to scratch the floor, trying not to cause a scene, until one day you realize you've been living for the room rather than in the room. This is where the pacing earns its patience, because the film takes time to show adaptation as a trap. It shows how a person can survive anything by becoming smaller, and it asks whether that kind of survival is actually living. The emotional rhythm is like this constant push and pull between numbness and clarity, numbness when the environment offers comfort, clarity when the characters feel the cost of accepting it. And the cost is always paid in identity. That's why the most intense moments in this story aren't necessarily the loud confrontations, they're the quiet decisions, the secret refusals, the little rebellions that nobody claps for. A character choosing not to smile at the right moment can carry more weight than a character screaming, because that withheld smile is a declaration, I will not perform my own captivity today. And when Uni's dark side starts surfacing, not villainy, but the shadow that comes from being emotionally starved, you feel the story getting more honest, because it's not afraid to show how pain can make you clingy, how it can make you manipulative without you even realizing, how it can make you confuse saving someone with owning them. There's a delicate danger in two trapped people trying to free each other, because sometimes they accidentally build a new cage out of their desperation, and the narrative plays with that tension. Are Siska and Uni each other's exit, or are they each other's excuse to stay? Are they holding hands to run, or holding hands to keep from falling, and does that grip become a shackle if neither of them can let go? That complexity is where the story starts to feel less like a plot and more like a lived experience, because real survival is messy. People in survival mode aren't poetic all the time. They are contradictory. They are brave one day and terrified the next. They promise themselves they'll leave and then they fold laundry like nothing is wrong, because sometimes your brain would rather do chores than face grief. And grief is a big, underappreciated presence here, the grief of realizing you've been living someone else's version of your life, the grief of realizing love was not love, the grief of realizing you can't get back the time you spent trying to earn what should have been freely given. The story doesn't treat escape like a triumphant sprint, it treats escape like mourning in motion. And that's why the emotional analysis of this project keeps coming back to one question: what does freedom sound like when you've been taught to whisper? The neat silence in Siska's world is one sound, a controlled sound, an obedient sound, an absence that feels imposed. The silence between Siska and Uni, on the other hand, can feel like solidarity, like two people sitting with the truth because they are finally safe enough to let it exist. Silence can be violence or it can be refuge, and the story seems deeply aware of that duality. If you're the kind of viewer who pays attention to what's not being said, this narrative rewards you, because so much of it is about the unspeakable, the feelings you're not allowed to have, the doubts you're not allowed to voice, the anger you're expected to swallow because anger makes you difficult. And in a lot of cultures, including many where stories like this resonate most, difficult is the word used to punish women who insist on having edges. That's why Siska's insistence on being real in an unreal perfection feels almost revolutionary, not because she's leading a movement, but because she's refusing to be anesthetized. Now, in terms of background and release context, 2025 has been a year where audiences seem increasingly hungry for stories that interrogate the narratives we've been sold: romance narratives, success narratives, if you have this you should be happy narratives, and Bukan Cinta tapi Pelarian fits into that hunger while also standing out because it doesn't replace one script with another. It doesn't say, love is bad, or men are bad, or relationships are prisons, in a simplistic way. It says, look closer, love can be used as a disguise, and the difference between love and disguise is whether your humanity is allowed to expand. That nuance is why it's the kind of title people discuss in group chats and comment sections, because it makes you ask uncomfortable questions about your own definitions. How many times have we called endurance loyalty when it was really fear? How many times have we called jealousy passion when it was really control? How many times have we applauded a relationship because it looked stable from the outside, while ignoring the person inside it slowly disappearing? The story's cultural impact, in that sense, isn't about memes or trends, it's about vocabulary. It gives viewers new words for old wounds. It hands you a mirror and says, you don't have to keep mistaking the mask for the face. And that's also why the project feels emotionally immersive. It's not asking you to solve a mystery, it's asking you to recognize a pattern. The Too Perfect World is, in many ways, an exaggerated version of the real world's expectations. Be polished, be presentable, don't be messy, don't be loud, don't be complicated, don't be inconvenient. The story takes that pressure and makes it tangible, almost architectural, so you can see it, so you can feel how it corners Siska. And then it gives us Uni, whose corner is softer but no less deadly, the corner where you tell yourself you're staying because you love someone, when really you're staying because leaving would mean admitting you were never chosen, and that admission can feel like a death. There's a reason one-sided love can pull people into dark places. It's not just rejection, it's the constant reopening of the wound, the daily proof that your needs don't matter as much as your usefulness. Uni's arc, at least as the premise frames it, becomes a study in what happens when you keep trying to earn dignity from someone who benefits from your hunger. And the most painful part is that it's not always the other person's overt cruelty that traps you, it's your own hope. Hope is beautiful, but hope, when it's attached to someone who won't carry it with care, can become self-harm. That's the darkness, not that Uni is bad, but that she's bleeding and calling it romance. And Siska, waking up into a staged life, is forced to look at her own role in the system too, because survival sometimes requires compromise, and compromise can turn into complicity if you're not careful. The story seems to understand that there's guilt on both sides of any cage, guilt for staying, guilt for leaving, guilt for wanting more, guilt for not being satisfied with what everyone else calls enough. That guilt is the chain most people don't talk about, because it's invisible. You can unlock a door and still feel chained if you've been trained to believe freedom makes you selfish. So when the narrative positions escape as the only way to live, it's not romanticizing running away, it's reframing self-preservation as a moral right. And in a cinematic sense, the strongest choice a story like this can make, and the one this premise implies, is to keep the tension internal even when the environment is external. You don't need chase scenes when the chase is happening inside the mind, the chase between who you are and who you're supposed to be. The tension between comfort and truth. The tension between being admired and being known. Because admiration is easy, it doesn't require intimacy. People admire objects. But being known requires you to have a self in the first place, and that's what these characters are fighting to keep. If you've ever had the experience of someone loving you in a way that felt like they were loving a projection, you understand how lonely that is. You can be in the center of someone's attention and still feel unseen. And that loneliness is the emotional weather of this story. It's humid. It sticks to everything. It makes every interaction feel slightly heavier than it should. Even kindness can feel suspicious when it comes with expectations. Even gifts can feel like debts. Even romance can feel like negotiation. That's why the film's emotional analysis keeps circling back to masks, not just the mask others wear to control you, but the mask you wear to survive them. The polite mask. The grateful mask. The I'm okay mask. The this is fine mask. And the tragedy is that if you wear a mask long enough, your face starts to forget what it looks like without it. That's what makes Siska's awakening so urgent. She's not just trying to get out of a place, she's trying to get back to herself before she forgets herself completely. And Uni, caught in her own trap, is trying to learn that love should not be a place where you beg. Love should not be a courtroom where you present evidence of your worth. Love should not be a job interview you keep failing and returning to anyway because you're convinced the rejection is your fault. The story's most resonant message, then, is not, run away from love, it's, run away from anything that calls itself love while shrinking you. And if you're watching this as someone who has had to rebuild their boundaries, you'll feel how accurate that is. Boundaries are not walls to keep love out, they are doors to keep respect in. Now, as a viewer, you might also be wondering about the truth. Siska and Uni realize, this idea that the world is too perfect to be real, that love is a mask, that escape is survival. And what I appreciate about how the premise frames it is that it treats truth as a process, not a revelation. Truth isn't one light switch moment, it's 1,000 little confirmations. It's a pattern emerging. It's the gradual recognition that your discomfort is consistent, that your intuition keeps pointing in the same direction, that the perfect life keeps demanding you pay with pieces of yourself. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, which is why the back half of a story like this often feels like emotional acceleration even if the plot isn't exploding with events. Because recognition changes everything. Once Siska recognizes she's been placed, every compliment becomes suspicious, every gesture becomes loaded, every romantic moment becomes a question: is this affection, or is this management? And once Uni recognizes her love has become a dark place, every message she sends, every apology she offers, every compromise she makes becomes a mirror. And mirrors are brutal when you've been living in denial. Denial is comfortable, clarity is sharp. This story chooses sharpness. It chooses to cut through the narrative sugar and show the bitter core, that survival sometimes means disappointing people, sometimes means being called ungrateful, sometimes means being labeled selfish by those who benefited from your selflessness. And that's where the cultural conversation gets spicy, because audiences often want a good victim, someone who suffers politely, someone who leaves cleanly, someone who doesn't cause collateral damage. But real leaving is ugly. Real leaving can involve lies to stay safe, calculated silence, strategic compliance, moments of weakness, moments of rage. Real leaving can involve hurting someone who claims to love you, because sometimes the only way to break a grip is to pry fingers off one by one, and the person gripping you will call that violence. The story, by framing its characters as not victims, not heroes, but humans who want to be free, gives them permission to be imperfect. It asks the audience to extend empathy without requiring purity. And that's rare, because a lot of narratives only allow women to be free if they are saintly. This one says you can be messy and still deserve air. Now, let's talk about why the emotional immersion works even at the level of concept. The world is too perfect, and that's such a clever way to externalize the internal experience of dissociation. People who are traumatized, controlled, or overwhelmed often describe feeling like they are watching their life from outside, like the world looks normal but feels fake, like everything is happening behind glass. A pristine, silent, luxurious environment can replicate that sensation. It's beautiful, but it's distant, it's safe, but it's not yours, it's real, but it doesn't feel real. By putting Siska in that environment, the story makes dissociation visible. And by pairing her with Uni, whose pain is more openly emotional and relational, the story bridges two forms of suffering that are often kept separate: the suffering of being controlled by environment and the suffering of being controlled by attachment. Both are about losing agency, just in different currencies. Siska loses agency to a role, Uni loses agency to hope. And if you want to get even deeper, the film's central argument might be that agency is the true romance. Not romance as in candles and flowers, but romance as in the right to choose your own life. Because what's more intimate than choice? What's more loving than allowing someone to be themselves without punishment? So when the story shows love functioning as a mask, it's essentially saying, anything that demands your silence as proof of devotion is not love, it's domination in perfume. And the way the narrative likely builds its emotional peaks, again, without locking ourselves to specific scenes, is by placing the characters in situations where the mask almost works. Moments where the comfort is almost convincing. Moments where the attention is almost flattering enough to numb the dread. Moments where the characters almost convince themselves that maybe they are the problem, maybe they are ungrateful, maybe they are overthinking. Those are the scariest moments, because that's how cages keep you in, not by force, but by persuasion. Persuasion is the velvet rope. The story's job is to make you feel the seduction of the trap while also making you feel the cost, and when it succeeds, you end up in this conflicted emotional state where you understand why someone might stay even as you're begging them to leave. That's good writing. That's empathy. That's refusing to simplify. And if the performances lean into that conflict, if Siska's face can show gratitude and dread at the same time, if Uni's voice can carry love and resentment in the same sentence, then the story becomes less about plot points and more about emotional truth. Because emotional truth is what makes a project like this stick. You might forget details, but you won't forget the feeling of being offered a dream life that feels like a nightmare with silk sheets. You won't forget the feeling of watching someone you care about keep going back to a person who only loves the power they have over them. And you won't forget the feeling of two friends realizing that survival might require them to become the villain in someone else's story, because people who control narratives always paint escape as betrayal. That's another theme here, narrative ownership. Who gets to define what happened? Who gets to label you? If you leave, do you become ungrateful, crazy, selfish, cold, dramatic? The story seems to understand that leaving often triggers a smear campaign, not necessarily public, but emotional. The people you leave behind rewrite you to protect their ego. And that's why the decision to escape is so heavy. It's not just leaving a place, it's leaving your reputation in the hands of people who never held your heart gently. So when you reach the emotional endgame of a story like this, the question isn't only, can they get out? It's, can they keep believing themselves after they are out? Because internalized gaslighting doesn't vanish when the door opens. Freedom is not just geography, it's psychology. And this is where I think Bukan Cinta Tapi Pelarian earns its right to be discussed. It's not a fantasy of rescue. It's not waiting for a prince, a savior, a perfect friend, a perfect plan. It's about the slow construction of courage, built from conversation, from shared recognition, from the moment you stop calling your pain romance. It's about two women choosing to step out of destinies written for them, and that phrasing matters, because written for them implies authorship, implies someone else holding the pen. Escape, in this story, is taking the pen back. And taking the pen back can look like running, yes, but it can also look like telling the truth out loud for the first time. It can look like refusing to play the role, refusing to smile on cue, refusing to say thank you for something you didn't ask for. It can look like choosing loneliness over being owned, which is a choice many people don't understand until they've lived it. And if you've never been in a situation where your autonomy was compromised, you might watch this and think, why don't they just leave? And the story's answer is, because leaving isn't just an action, it's a war against conditioning. Conditioning that tells you safety equals approval. Conditioning that tells you love equals endurance. Conditioning that tells you your needs are burdens. Conditioning that tells you the world is kinder to compliant women than to free women. And once you see that conditioning at work, you realize the villains in this story, whether they are people, systems, or simply expectations, are not just external threats, they are ideas that have taken root in the characters' minds. That's why the fight is so hard. You're not just fighting a person, you're fighting a belief. And beliefs don't bleed, which means they don't die easily. So as a viewing experience, this becomes the kind of narrative where the most satisfying moments are not necessarily the biggest, but the truest, a character finally naming what happened, a character finally acknowledging that a love that hurts you repeatedly is not something you have to keep honoring, a character finally choosing herself without apologizing for the inconvenience. Those are the moments that make audiences sit up and feel seen, and they also tend to spark conversation because they challenge the moral scripts we've been taught. The film's cultural impact, if it lands, is going to be less about box office chatter and more about people quietly re-evaluating their lives. People messaging their friends like, "This reminded me of you, are you okay?" People realizing that what they called romantic persistence was actually refusal to accept boundaries. People realizing that being too sensitive was actually their nervous system screaming the truth. And that's the kind of impact art is supposed to have, not just entertain, but retune your instincts. By the time you're deep into this story, you're no longer watching for plot, you're watching for liberation. You're watching for the moment the characters stop negotiating with the cage. And when that moment comes, or when it starts to come, because it's rarely one moment, you feel a strange mix of triumph and grief, because freedom is not free. Freedom costs relationships, comfort, certainty, and sometimes it costs the illusion that the people around you were good. It costs the fantasy that if you behave correctly, you will be loved correctly. And letting go of that fantasy is devastating. But it's also the beginning of real life. That's why the final emotional aftertaste of Bukan Cinta Pelarian isn't sweetness, it's clarity. It's the taste of cold water after you've been drinking sugar for too long. It's not as immediately pleasurable, but it's honest, and honesty is what keeps you alive. If I had to sum up what the story does to you, it's this: it makes you suspicious of perfection, it makes you protective of your inner voice, and it makes you understand that escape is not cowardice when staying means slowly dying. And if you're still here with me listening to this review, chances are you already feel what the title is trying to teach. Sometimes the bravest love story is the one where the characters choose themselves, not because they hate love, but because they finally respect it enough not to accept its counterfeit.